Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide, and today I wanted to talk about the PlayStation 5. The system's been out for about 2.5 years at this point, and today I just want to kind of give my thoughts and impressions on what I think of the console after having used it for the last few years, and whether or not it's worth picking up in 2023. And I want to go through kind of each category one by one. Now, initially, Sony made a huge deal over the DualSense controllers and promised a level of haptic feedback that we hadn't seen before, and not just in the triggers, but in the entire controller. Unfortunately, though, the only game that truly takes advantage of everything that this controller has to offer, even 2.5 years later, is Astro's Playroom, and this game is incredible. It was literally a pack-in game designed to show off what this controller can do, so it makes sense that it is a showpiece for the technology, but it's kind of disappointing that no other game has really truly taken advantage of it since. There are a lot of first-person shooters where the triggers do offer some resistance. Here we're taking a look at Call of Duty, and while it's really neat in theory, in practice, what this does is it makes it harder for you to pull the trigger by giving you physical resistance depending on the gun that you're shooting. In single-player games, this isn't that big of a deal, but in multiplayer games particularly, if you're playing competitively, that gives you a huge disadvantage because it just adds to the time that it takes you to get a shot off, and making it more difficult for you to fire your gun is just the complete opposite of what you want in a game like that. Speaking of multiplayer gaming, having a microphone built into the controller, although it may not seem like a big deal, is so convenient. You can just grab your controller, you can speak directly into it, and with the included speaker, you can also hear the responses without the need of a headset. Sony really emphasized the importance of its lightning-fast SSD storage with the PlayStation 5, and that's turned out to be a huge game changer for this generation. One of the biggest and most important, I think. Games on the PlayStation 5 load dramatically faster than they did on last generation hardware, which only utilized a 5400 RPM mechanical drive. Things have changed dramatically with the PlayStation 5, even if the game wasn't built for it specifically. All the developer has to do is update the game with a patch, and it will still take advantage of the SSD, as you can see here with The Last of Us Part 2. You're already in the game playing most of the time before the PlayStation 4 is even halfway through loading the games. This is a huge quality of life improvement, in my opinion, with these current generation consoles. When the PlayStation 5 was unveiled for the first time, ray tracing was another big feature that Sony touted, and the technology promised to revolutionize the way that we look at games today. But sadly, very few games really take advantage of its full potential. One of the best examples is Miles Morales or the Spider-Man games. Now, this was a launch game on the PlayStation 5, and to this day, in my opinion, is still the best use of this technology on the PlayStation 5 so far. You can see the before and after here is quite impressive, but I don't think any other game that's come out in the last 2.5 years has taken advantage of ray tracing quite as well as Spider-Man does. Another great example of the use of the technology is another game that came out in the launch window, Ratchet & Clank. This game isn't quite as impressive as Spider-Man, but it is still a really great example of the technology in use. And unfortunately, these two games, which came out in the launch window of the PlayStation 5, remain the only real showpieces for the technology on the system. So there aren't a lot of wow factor games that blow you away from a visual perspective this generation, and there are a few reasons for that. With the PlayStation 1, we had these really low 200 polygon models. With the PlayStation 2, that increased. With the PlayStation 3 and 4, it increased even more, but right around, I'd say, the PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4 era of gaming, you reach a point of diminishing returns where you can only go so far when it comes to sheer brute force hardware. And a lot of the technological advancements we're going to see now are going to be on the back end. Mike Cerny kind of explains this a little bit here.
It's also key to make a generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently familiar to game developers. I think about this in terms of balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, the target was a revolution each time with a brand new feature set. That was great in many ways, but time for the developers to get up and running got longer with each console. On the other hand, if we're trying to reduce that dead time to zero, that means the hardware architecture can't change at all. We're handcuffed. We need to judge for each feature what value it adds and whether it's worth the increase in developer time needed to support it.
So one of the great things about Sony moving to standard x86-based architecture with the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 is that backwards compatibility is completely seamless now. The overwhelming majority of your PlayStation 4 games will work just right out of the box on the PlayStation 5, and that's amazing to see. That's something that Sony has always historically done, but in limited fashion. Both the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3, at least the initial launch models, provided limited backwards compatibility support, but the PlayStation 5 takes it to a whole nother level, where it's seemingly built into the system itself, and it's a much more streamlined process that hopefully will continue for future generation of Sony consoles. And I really commend Sony for taking backwards compatibility more serious this time around. So let's talk about the library of games. PlayStation consoles in general have an unparalleled level of quality when it comes to software. They have some of the most amazing game developers on the planet, and somehow managed to provide a consistent stream of quality exclusive titles for their systems. But there's a problem. Do you really need a PlayStation 5 right now, at least, to play those games? Well, let's take a look at some of the best on offer here. Starting with God of War Ragnarok. This is a Game of the Year contender, one of the best games released in the last few years. Graphically, it looks absolutely stunning, but it's also available on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro and looks great on those consoles. If we jump over to Sackboy, it's the same story here. This is a really fun, more family-friendly game. Visually it looks great, but it is also available on PlayStation 4 family of consoles, so you don't need a PlayStation 5 to play this. Jumping over to Horizon Forbidden West, it's much the same story. Graphically stunning game, but also available on last-gen hardware and looks and runs great on that hardware. Spider-Man Miles Morales is another example of a graphically stunning game and one of the highlights for the PlayStation 5, but it's a game that you don't need a PlayStation 5 to play. So the common theme here is that you can still play these on last generation hardware and you're only missing out on a select few features such as ray tracing and maybe some performance options. Even third-party games that are graphically stunning like the recent Resident Evil 4 remake are also available on last generation hardware, and this game looks unbelievable. I just finished my second playthrough of it and I really enjoyed it, but again, if you have a PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 4 Pro, you wouldn't have missed out on this. It's still available on that hardware. And that's not to say there aren't any great PlayStation 5 only games. Gran Turismo 7 is a great example. This game looks stunning and it's a great racing game. And is only on the PlayStation 5. Ratchet & Clank is another great example of a game that is only on the PlayStation 5. The thing about these two examples, though, is if you remove the ray tracing and some other features, there's not a lot here that would prevent games like this from running on last generation hardware. In fact, if we jump over to IGN.com and look at their current top 25 games for the PlayStation 5 in 2023, the overwhelming majority of these games are playable on the PlayStation 4. There's only a handful, maybe 3 or 4, on this list that you have to have a PlayStation 5 to play, and that's one of my biggest gripes with this system, and it's not a Sony problem. This applies to Xbox as well. Last generation hardware, to some extent, unfortunately, is holding current generation hardware back from reaching its full potential, and is being supported longer and longer each generation. I think Sony's in a better position than Xbox when it comes to being held back, because for some reason Microsoft made two wildly different pieces of hardware here with the Xbox Series S and Series X. The Series S is 1/3 as powerful as the Series X, and in a lot of cases can't hit the 1440p resolution target that Microsoft promised, and in a lot of cases games just flat out will not run with ray tracing enabled. I think that Sony made a much smarter move because they also give you a cheaper option in the form of the PlayStation 5 Digital Edition. But the only difference between the two is that one has a disk drive and the other doesn't. They're functionally exactly the same. You're not sacrificing performance or visual fidelity if you go the cheaper route. You're just saving $100. So if you don't care about physical media, you still get all the graphical bells and whistles and save $100. And I think that's the better way to go. And you can't really blame Sony for continuing to focus on the PlayStation 4 because that's overwhelmingly where most of their revenue is still coming from. And that's partly to do with the fact that up until the last few months, you couldn't find a PlayStation 5 sitting on store shelves. They were sold out immediately or picked up by scalpers as soon as they became available. So they were almost impossible to find. Most people are still on last-gen hardware. Or maybe you could find one, but you just don't want to plop $500 to leap into next generation quite yet, because everything that you want to play, or the majority of the things that you want to play, are still available on the console that you already have. Now let's talk about the user interface. Is it better than the PlayStation 4? I'd say no. I don't think it's better. I don't think it's worse necessarily. It's just different. And some aspects of it I like better, and some aspects of it I like worse. I like that the games and media are separated into two different kind of sections, and it is neat that while you're in a game you can hit the home button and quickly check your messages or check your friend status or listen to music or fiddle around with options without having to leave the actual game. And they did include some neat features like these cards that you can see above that give you a progress indicator of how close you are to hitting a certain achievement or trophy. But a lot of these things are great in theory, but in practice, again, just don't get used a lot. The menus can sometimes feel a bit cumbersome. If we jump over to PlayStation services, PlayStation Plus has evolved with the PlayStation 5 and now includes 3 tiers: Essential, Extra, and Deluxe. Each one brings with it a number of monthly games that you get for free and different perks and discounts. But in my experience, I don't think any of these are really essential unless you're a huge multiplayer person. If you play multiplayer games all day long, then you're going to need one of these out of necessity, but I don't think the 2 additional options are really contributing much here. PlayStation Now is still a terrific service. I used it in the past. If you have a good internet connection, there's very little lag and the image quality is pretty good. And not only can you use this on PlayStation platforms, but you can use it on the PC as well. So even if you don't have a piece of PlayStation hardware, you can still enjoy their software on other platforms. And Sony is really pushing cloud services this generation, a lot more so than they did last gen. So it may seem like I'm harping on the PlayStation 5 a lot, but I love this system. Some advantages are much faster loading times there. I can't understate how great that is. You also get way more gaming options, specifically when it comes to your performance and quality modes. Almost every PlayStation 5 game comes with a variety of different modes to suit your playstyle. A lot of games even support 120 frames per second. The console also supports variable refresh rates if you have a TV or monitor that supports it. Obviously, it supports ray tracing, which last generation was not capable of doing. And then it also has backwards compatibility, which is amazing because if you do decide to take the leap into next generation, you can take all of your games with you, so you don't have to start from scratch. But just keep in mind that a lot of these benefits are quality of life changes that really add up. Now, one thing that is a huge generational leap is PlayStation VR 2, which you can only experience with a PlayStation 5. This is a massive step up if you're looking for a visual jump. The headset now has 4K panels with HDR support. They are OLED screens. The system supports the Tempest 3D audio engine, and the controllers even support the full haptic level of immersion and feedback that you get from the DualSense controller. So this is a huge deal if you're into VR. Then this might be a reason alone for you to upgrade. Now let's talk about the design a little bit. I'll be honest with you, when I first saw this design, I thought it was absolutely gorgeous. I was like, wow, this is beautiful, it looks futuristic, but over the years, I've come to really not like it a lot. It's just a really impractical design. It's more fashion over function, I think. The flaps on the side are completely unnecessary. They look like horns. It doesn't really fit with the aesthetic of anything else in my living room, and to get it seated horizontally. It requires this plastic addition that you have to try to hold in place at the bottom there, and that can become finicky. If you accidentally bump the console, that's easy to come out. I'm just not a fan of the design. So some final thoughts. I think this is an excellent console. And if I were to give it a rating in 2023, I would give it an 8.5 out of 10. I think that its biggest issues are not its fault, necessarily. I think that its biggest issues have to do with the fact that support for the previous generation of consoles is lasting far longer than it did with other generation cycles, and I honestly, it doesn't feel like this generation has actually really started yet. I don't think that's going to happen for like another year and a half at least. Once we start getting games that were built from the ground up for the PlayStation 5 with no other considerations in mind, I think that's when you'll get the big wow moments and the must-have games that you just need to go out and buy this system. But I will be honest, and I've said this before, I think that if you currently own a PlayStation 4 Pro, you're not missing out on a lot, because you can still play the overwhelming majority of the games that are on the PlayStation 5 at higher than 1080p resolutions and get a really great experience. If you skip the PlayStation 4 generation, then absolutely this is a must. Pick it up, it's amazing. Or even if you're thinking about building like a low to mid-range PC and you're worried about the cost of parts, this is a great alternative. It's such a good piece of hardware in my opinion, and highly recommended. Let me know what you think in the comments below.